really wanted to get started with a very strange interlude. I got asked to do this talk kind of at the last minute, so this has just been kind of thrown together in the last 4 weeks. And during that time, the planet Pluto went retrograde, which kind of like has been an energy that's just been covering the whole time here. And there's a lovely book. It's been around for about 50 years. It just basically has picture symbols for every degree of the zodiac. And just on a whim, I just said, okay, well, what does that one for Pluto standing still? And as often happens when you start looking for coincidences, they find you. The degree for this one says a woman reading tea leaves. And it says the ability to see the signature of hidden meaning in every occurrence drawing one's attention. This refers to a specific technique of understanding or evaluation. What is implied is the ability not only to perceive the facts of everyday existence, but to see through these facts and discover how they are related to the realm of basic meanings and archetypal processes. This is essentially what is meant by true clairvoyance, the ability to see everything in the signature of deeper realities. So we could end right there if we wanted to.
And just all sit stunned.
Yeah. So when coincidences like that show up, you just bow down and enjoy them. It does turn out that astrology happens to be a really, really good language for talking about energies anyway. This is one of the things that was my original connection with Matt Wood, was that we discovered we both had a love of astrology. And so it's a nice way to introduce the topic that we're going to be talking about tonight. Plus, in a sense, it also talks about how even just the world around us has its own signatures. And so there's a kind of like a wider context that's going on with this material. Now, in terms of kind of a background on this stuff, I have been doing a lot of research the last 5-6 years, reading up on the history and philosophy of flower essences, and in particular trying to figure out what Edward Bach was doing when he came up with this thing in the first place back in the 1930s, and dealing with a lot of my issues with the way he did things. But a lot of this work has since then led to me actually getting down and starting to write an extensive amount of material on my approach to flower essences. And as always happens in my life, when I need to explain something to myself, I start writing books that never get published, but this one might at some point. So as a way to kind of explain this whole idea of subtle energy, which to me is the foundation of flower essence work, to both myself and figure out how to teach it, I needed to be writing. And a lot of that just basically boils down to when an idea crosses my mind, I just put it on a computer file someplace and come back, a month later and say, like, what the heck does this mean? So I've been in the process of trying to like decipher all these weird inspirations that have been coming through for the last 3 or 4 years. Those computer files now basically constitute about 50 to 100 pages of notes at this point, which are gradually becoming a huge amount of material. Anyway, this whole talk basically boils down to like one phrase that came to me one day that just boils down to 4 words. It said, the voice in my head was saying, signature of a person. Okay, what does that mean? We'll have to figure this out. So I will apologize ahead of time. Some of these ideas are still half-baked. I haven't figured out all this idea myself, but this talk has given me an opportunity to try and make sense of this idea. And of course, then the sirens start to talk. All right. Now, the thing is that in the process of kind of like redefining how I work with flower essences compared to a lot of practitioners, this also gives you a really good opportunity to take ideas that are considered to be commonplace and reinterpret them in a different way. So we're going to be kind of putting aside some of the common assumptions about energy work and exploring what my pages and pages of notes have been coming to me. Now, tonight we're talking about the doctrine of signatures, which sounds like it's kind of like a slim topic to, most people, when they talk about the doctrine of signatures, they're done in 5 minutes. So I'm a little bit concerned about one, whether I'm going to have enough material for tonight, and two, whether I'm going to have way too much material. So it's a combination of both here. The topic sounds like it's kind of a little bit restricted and limited in its own way, and also rather abstract, kind of philosophical in a sense. There's not going to necessarily be a lot of, take nettles for this and that kind of advice going on here. But I found that the more that I was thinking about this topic, that it kind of has connections in all sorts of directions that are applicable to the actual practice of flower essence therapy. And it sheds a lot of light on a lot of more the theoretical and the philosophical issues, which is what I've been concerned with the last 5-6 years. Since these are also the same ideas that cause all the conflicts and arguments between different modalities. And in fact, this whole idea of doctrine of signatures is one of those ideas that has really split the different modalities in some very, very different directions. So I won't necessarily be able to solve the war, but we're gonna take a look at some different directions and some different ways of interpreting some of these interesting theoretical ideas. Now, flower essence therapy can be considered to be a form of subtle energy healing. And so right there, we've already started introducing some of the key ideas that we're going to be talking about. Subtle energy healing can just basically be using the energy of a flower to basically, well, if you've got a person with problems, essentially their energy body is going to be out of sorts. And so what you use the flower essences for is just basically to reboot the person. As they always say, whenever your computer messes up, you just turn the power off, stick it back in and see if it works. Well, flower essences have the ability to help reboot people, kind of clear their minds of a lot of the ideas that are holding them back, and then allow you to move on in a healthier fashion from that point. So it's like when the person gets stuck in a pattern, some kind, like a broken record, then you just come along and you give them a little nudge and move the needle a little bit, and then they can get on with their lives. Flower essence therapy, from its inception with Dr. Bach's work back in the 1930s, has always dealt in kind of a spiritual interpretation or a spiritual way of interpreting the work. And that has not necessarily helped make it a clear topic for understanding things. So I apologize ahead of time if things sound a little obscure or a little abstract at times. But rather than worry about what's the spiritual forces going on in the flower essences, just let me just say right ahead that if you start from the idea of the spiritual of the subtle energy concept, and by subtle I just mean energies are the capacity for change that is not necessarily. So this is one of the differences between this and normal herbalism, is that we're dealing strictly with these non-material, non-tangible kinds of energies, and using that for healing purposes. So a flower essence is really just little more than a recording of the energy pattern of a flower inside some kind of a liquid medium, usually water and brandy is the way that it's going to be going. So I'm going to have to introduce a couple of more ideas that we're going to expand on for the rest of the talk here. One's going to be the idea of signatures, and one's going to be the idea of correspondences. And we'll kind of get through that material first. But the idea of a signature is that it's really just some kind of observable expression that an energy body of an organism has that can be expressed or observed via form, function, behavior, some kind of awareness, some kind of behavior patterns, whatever that organism has in their just day-to-day life. So it's going to include things like I said, their form, function, behavior, the environment that they live in, the company that they keep out in the wild, and just their lifestyle in general, basically, you find that a lot of these plants are going to have lifestyle choices that make them very, very good medicinal companions for us. If you can't necessarily perceive the field directly, you can always use this signature or these expressions that you're able to notice, just like figure out, oh, okay, this is what the plant is trying to tell me. And then you can start to work backwards through the patterns that you can visibly see or perceive somehow. Work backwards to seeing how does their energy body work and what does this mean in terms of their healing characteristics. So we're using the signatures as a way to encapsulate what we know about the plant, and then to work backwards to understand the healing property and the energy signature that they have that makes them who they are. This same distinction between the energy that's inherent in the organism and the signature that we perceive of it is going to be something that you see happening for all organisms, not just plants. And it can be generalized in some interesting ways to incorporate other topics, including the fact that when we talk about an energy, person's energy being out of balance or out of sorts, or even in the extreme that they have certain diseases or illnesses or something like that, that is just that the energy body is out of sort. But how do you recognize it? How do you understand what that imbalance means? And in essence, that in order to understand the imbalance or how the field is distorted, you have to look at how is that distortion being expressed? How is it being communicated to us? Yeah.
Yeah, I read that some of the flowers are basically sexual orientation. You talk about transferring that energy somehow.
Mm-hmm.
How do you explain the sexual portions of the energy transformed?
Well, for starters, the flower is essentially just the sexual organs of the plant itself. So if it's expressing its ability to reproduce, it's going to be doing it through some kind of sexual context. And when we translate that to a human context, that correspondence between what the plant's doing and what we do, the natural expression of it is going to be through sexuality and behavior patterns that we experience as sexual behavior. So yeah, it's, like I said, once you get into this material, it starts to spread a lot of light on topics that seem very confusing at first, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, no big deal. So we'll be seeing that kind of analogical thinking on and on and on as we go through tonight.
I'm trying to translate it into philosophy, like maybe the flowers are hedonistic or something.
Why not? Why not? So yeah, when the field is out of balance or distorted somehow, it's going to show up in changes of behavior, changes of form, changes of function, all the same patterns that we were talking about with the plant. So even the human beings are going to have these kinds of signatures when we study them a little bit more. And in fact, when we look at the way that illnesses are expressed, this is what are called symptoms in common medical terminology. So one of the thoughts that was coming up for this is that symptoms of an illness are literally just the signature of the illness itself. The illness itself is a pattern of energy that's moving through the organism, and it's going to express itself just like any other field of energy is going to do. And that expression is going to show up as the symptoms, physical and behavioral and otherwise, that then will describe what is the nature and form and function of that illness in the organism. Now, I have to mention a story. When you get into flower essences after a while, you start developing very strong personal relationships with certain plants. And in particular, one of my favorite plants is she got chopped down last year, but a willow tree that's down by Lake of the Isles over here. And I've had a long relationship with this particular tree. I consider her basically to be my emotional support tree during all the weirdness of the last few years. Anyway, I remember one time walking down by the lake and I noticed that like a huge branch on her tree had fallen down and broken off. And I, of course, was mortified by the whole thing. Oh, are you okay? You're fine. Da, da, da. And as often happens, then the tree talks back to me and says like, look, I'm a willow. It's what we do. Boom. Willows are always dropping branches. So, it's what we do. That is the expression of the energy body in physical form. It's what we do. Kind of coming back to the wisdom of this tree a couple of times as we talk along here. Now, the second word that I wanted to get to is the idea of correspondences. These are connections, typically analogies or relationships or similarities between two different kinds of organisms that are expressing themselves in a different language, but deep down, those two types of expressions are really saying much the same thing. And if you know that the tree is saying this, and I'm saying this, and there's kind of like a healing response that goes between them, there's some kind of correspondence between these two energy expressions. And in fact, this idea of correspondences is how you translate the energies of plants into the energies of people as the basis of a healing context. So we're looking for meaningful similarities in the signatures between different kinds of organisms, in our case, plants and people, and finding out what they have in common. And hopefully, as I said earlier with signatures, you use the signature to kind of work backwards and understand what the energy is like. And so hopefully when you see these connections, this will also point to some kind of energy phenomena that allow us to understand how these different kinds of organisms can interact and relate to each other and for the purposes of healing. It's very similar in a lot of ways to the idea of synchronicity, if you're familiar with the works of Carl Jung, because his whole idea of synchronicity is that idea of a meaningful coincidence or a meaningful correspondence between two different sets of phenomena that seem on the surface to be unrelated. This idea of correspondences is also the philosophical basis behind the whole idea of a materia medica, which is the big fat books that we have that describe this plant has these characteristics and it treats these kinds of illnesses and it relates to these kind of symptoms in the human being and blah, 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 blah. Basically, all this is just sets of correspondences between these two signatures, plant and person. So already we're starting to see that, the doctrine of signatures, while it looks like a very, simplistic kind of idea to hang our hats on for an hour, really is starting to have these tentacles that are reaching out into all sorts of areas of healing that may seem unrelated at first. When it comes to talking about signatures for people in particular, we really wind up telling a lot of stories. Story seems to be the language that people describe themselves in. So whereas my problems and why is my husband treating me like this and da da da. So we're going to have tons and tons of stories. And this basically, the idea of stories takes us out of the rational mind and allows us to start thinking more metaphorically and more in terms of analogies, which allow us to break down the barriers between what separates us from other organisms, what separates us from the plants, and allow us to see where the commonalities are that bring us together. And in this way, the signatures act as a kind of a memory device or a mnemonic for us to help to understand what the plant is about and how we're supposed to be relating to it, and how we're supposed to be using it for healing purposes. Almost always this kind of thinking is going to kind of boil down to a big 3-step process. One of them is that you spend a lot of time studying the signature of the plant and trying to perceive what is it all about? What's this plant trying to tell us? And then from there, you start to work backwards to understand, oh, because it expresses itself like this, those expressions are a matter of the energy body working in a certain fashion. So the signature allows us to work backwards and try to understand more what this plant is like as an energy being, just like we are energy beings. And the third step is you just pray like hell that you have one of those big aha moments that puts all these things and all these details into some larger pattern and helps you integrate all this information that is useful for you and allows you to actually work with the energy in a way that makes sense. When I was thinking about this paragraph earlier today, it reminded me of a quotation from a British homeopath of the late 1900s, late 19th century that Matt likes to quote. He uses this quote a lot in his classes, which is where I first heard it. He also has it in one of his books. James Compton Burnett once was quoted as saying, like, I don't look where you look. I let my imagination play around the case. So a lot of this work with the Doctrine of Signatures is really a matter of the imaginative mind taking over from where the rational mind can no longer go and starting to make sense where sense did not exist before. Okay, so a little bit of a summary here on how I've been working with the idea of subtle energy for the last 3 or 4 years. Got like 3 small little comments here, but that's my summary for what amounts to about a 50-page chapter in the book that I'm writing. So this is a very complicated topic when you get down to the nuts and bolts of it, but the idea of subtle energy, this idea that there's an energy or a force that works through organisms that's operating at a non-material level, and however you want to call it, it can have some kind of spiritual domain, and look at it, look at people and animals and plants and so on from a kind of a higher perspective than we had before. This leads us into the whole idea of what subtle energy is about. And from there, we are led to the idea of the energy body, which is the subtle energy patterns that underlie the human being, underlie the plant, underlie whatever organism you're talking about, and is responsible for creating their form, their function, their body, their behavior, and all the other things that we can perceive directly with our senses. And also at a more subtle level, once you start to tune into the energies, you can start to tune into the energies directly a little bit more. Anytime you work with flower remedies for any length of time, you're going to start to tune into that level. And it gets to be, it shows you a whole new mysterious realm of reality that you didn't suspect was there before. And that really illuminates a lot of our understanding of healing and medicine that we weren't seeing before. It turns out that this whole concept of the energy body, the energy field that underlies every individual being, that you can think of it as the aura or the energy field around the human body, or however you want to visualize it. But this field concept is the common ground behind understanding how all organisms work and understanding our connection between all organisms, and makes the whole idea of correspondences something that's tangible and real for our purposes. Keep in mind that this whole idea of subtle energy and our perceptions of it are 2 different things. Though in common usage, they are almost always confused and conflated with each other. There's a difference between the energy in its own right and the way that we perceive it. Our perceptions are always colored by the way that our minds work, and our nervous systems are operating and so on like that. So you can pick up all this information. What all that information is picking up is the signature. But the signature is teaching us about how the energy body itself works. But they're two different concepts at this point. Similarly, with ideas of illnesses versus symptoms. This is one of the big controversial topics that you see over and over again in some of the more philosophical writings, both of flower essences and homeopathy and even herbalism to a certain extent, is that there's a difference between the symptoms that a person presents to the healer that you're supposed to be working with and the actual illness that underlies those symptoms. The symptoms are just the expression of the illness. The illness itself is that the energy body is out of whack, imbalanced, not operating properly, and that we somehow need to like figure out how do we get the energy body rebooted so that it's working again. And when we do that, it's not going to produce those symptoms anymore. And a lot of confusion that you're going to be seeing between different healing modalities is between this distinction between what is the symptom, what is a symptom, and what is the actual illness that's underlying it. In particular, this is one of the big arguments between the homeopaths and the AMA technical doctors, because they're each accusing the other side of, you're just treating symptoms, you're not getting to the real illness. And they both have different definitions of what the illness is and different definitions of what constitutes a symptom. And so we're needing to start to make a distinction between those two levels of understanding a person and realize that there's more going on. Just, your blood pressure's high, we need to give you a blood pressure drug, or you're having depression, so we need to give you a certain plant or a certain essence that's going to treat the depression. The depression's not the problem. The problem is that their energy body is not working properly. So even within holistic healing, we have a real confusion between symptom and illness that's going on. And that's where a lot of the arguments between different modalities all come from. In the reading that I've been doing the last 5-6 years, you keep seeing this argument playing out over and over and over again. This is one of the big arguments between flower essence people and homeopaths, is that we still don't agree on what's symptom and what's illness, and we look at these things from a different point of view, which is kind of funny because Edward Bach actually started out as a homeopath and then went into flower essence work. And you'd think that would have carried over at some point, but he actually totally turned the whole idea of illness and symptom on his head and started over again when he dropped out of the homeopathy field in the late 1920s. So what we're doing is we're using the signatures. Yeah, sure.
Was he more psychological though, with the flowers, or?
Actually, from everything, I've tried to find everything I can that he's written, the word psychology never passes his lips, which I find fantastic because the 1920s and 1930s were the heyday of psychoanalysis over in Europe. And his approach was a purely spiritual approach. He does not talk about, your ego being imbalanced or you have a bad relationship with the unconscious or anything like that. He always talks about in terms of that the person, and by that he means the ego level person, is out of touch or out of sympathy with the higher self, using that strictly as a spiritual term. And one of the interesting problems that I have with Bach is just that, nowadays the whole idea of psychology is such a given in our culture that trying to understand his approach to flower essences is something totally devoid of this psychological understanding. It's a little startling. I remember having a conversation with Matt one time about this and pointed out that there's no psychology in Bach. And he looked really startled for about 5 seconds and he said, yeah, you're right. There is no psychology there. So if you bring psychology into flower essence work, you're going to have to change the modality a little bit, change your understanding of how you work. And so it's very interesting that the field of flower essences has actually gone off in a totally different direction than Bach originally intended. Modern interpretations of flower essence therapy are quite different than what he originally had expected it to be. Yeah.
I see. You mentioned the auric fields. Have you found, Jupiter has a pretty strong effect on people. Have you found a way to measure energy being emitted from flowers? When say Jupiter's prominent in the sky, is there a way to measure
This is where, I had that distinction earlier about the difference between rational thinking and more imaginative or intuitive thinking. The whole concept of measurement is really more of a rational scientific approach. I don't know of any way that I would trust to put a plant inside some kind of electronic measuring box and say, like, this is what it's doing. I guess there are some people who do that sort of stuff, but it seems to be kind of a counterproductive way to work with the flower remedies, especially since the best way to observe a plant is just to observe the plant without some device between you and the being that you're looking at. It's like me, instead of having a conversation with you, well, let's hook you up to an EKG machine and see what your blood pressure and your heart is telling me, and that'll be what we're saying is communication. That doesn't teach me anything about who you are and how you behave. It's the same thing with plants. You can put them in all the electronic machines you want to, but you're not going to really understand the beingness of that plant because of that way of operating. So I'm very much of that we need to just develop our own intuitive ability to perceive the energies directly, as opposed to letting machines take over for us. That's just an approach philosophically that I find a little bit abhorrent for my part. I'm also
starting with the signature of the plant.
Yeah, if you start with the signature of the plant, that'll teach you much more about the plant than will be some so we can use the signature of the plant as a way to kind of like describe, categorize, model, express whatever our understanding is of that subtle energy field that the organism is putting out, and allow us to work with it in a much more concrete fashion than it would be if we were just kind of like doing the airy-fairy approach to it without trying to categorize it and make some sense of it somehow. And in fact, this whole idea of understanding the signature of an organism is one of the key qualities that it takes to be a good natural healer. If you can understand that the plant at a very intimate level of how they're expressing their energies, what those expressions are, and how it relates to or corresponds to the way humans express their energies, then you understand what the medicine is in that plant. And then you can work with it and see some really good healing responses. So it's this whole idea of translating the energy of the plant into human terms that allows us to say, this is what this medicine does for us. All right, now the whole idea of the Doctrine of Signatures is something that goes all the way back to, well, really ancient times. Probably showed up in modern European thought back in like about the 1500s or something like that, and the heyday of alchemy, times of Paracelsus and so on. The old-fashioned notion of signatures was usually based on the shape, the color, the tastes, things like that about the plant that somehow or another resembled something going on in the human body. So, for instance, if it had a shape that looked like the heart or shaped like the liver or something like that, you're going like, oh, this must be a liver or this must be a heart or this must be something for the lungs. The colors are always important because the colors indicate, where, what level of existence that we're talking about. Like yellow flowers often always indicate something to deal with the thinking mind. Purple flowers are usually something that's more of a spiritual level. If it's like red or orange, usually there's more of an emotional component. And even when you get down to the red flowers, that's usually something that's more physical in nature. And so they were just using a lot of these common, easily perceived ways of looking at the plant as a way of saying, this is the signature of the plant, and this is how it relates to this kind of healing. This is what this medicine is for. Now, these types of understandings are usually mostly very static categories and pretty shallow kinds of correspondences between plants and humans. The way that I'm using the term signatures tonight is a much broader interpretation of it. It's not just the physical form and structure and color, blah, 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 that we see, but it's literally everything that plant does to express itself in this life. Its behavior patterns. Where does it grow? What plants does it like to hang out with and which ones is it antithetical to, and so on. So there's just a lot of, there's a much broader sense of the idea of how does the field express itself that we're dealing into. And on any different levels of it that we perceive things, both the physical level and things that we consider more like the emotional, mental, and even spiritual levels of the plant. Yes.
You're talking to the root to the fruit, right? All the way, the whole plant.
The whole plant, yeah. And I'll give you a couple of examples here in a minute that will make this a little bit more understandable. Now, when we make a remedy of the plant, and I'm thinking here specifically in terms of the flower essence work, what we're really doing is we're transferring the plant's energy and the patterns in that energy that we perceive as the signature, but we're actually working with the energy itself and transferring it to a liquid carrier. It's usually like a brandy water mixture. So the energy is actually passing over from the plant to the solution that we're making. And consequently, the signature of the plant is going to have a very strong correspondence to what the signature of the remedy is. And by the signature of the remedy, I mean, like, how does it feel? How does it affect the pulse? How does it affect, people that have certain symptoms that we think of as illnesses and so on. And so we're always trying to translate the innate understanding that we have of the plant into an understanding of the remedy, which inevitably starts to bleed into, we describe the remedy itself in terms of human categories, not plant categories anymore. You read your average flower essence book and you look at the profile of that plant. They are not necessarily going to spend a lot of time talking about what the root structure is, and they may mention the color of the plant and something like that, or that it grows in a certain area, but they pass very quickly to, and that means that it treats these kind of psychological patterns in people. And so the whole idea of what is the signature of the remedy is different from the signature of the plant, even though they are very strongly related to each other, because we're already starting to make those correspondences, those links of analogies and metaphors that take us into the human realm. Yeah.
Because you were talking about your class about the Australian remedies, but if we don't live in Australia, I always feel like
we don't?
Surprise!
Near us, how can they understand us? So I'm just always curious, why would I want desert flower essences?
Okay, well,
so I'm
just because you can't watch the plant yourself personally doesn't mean you can't trust somebody who does.
Yeah.
And so particularly, I mean, this is one thing that people always say about the Australian remedies, like, well, I don't live in Australia. Why do I have to deal with this? So, do they work for us because we're North American people, and there's always an idea that local plants are more important to us than plants that are halfway around the world. To a certain extent, that's true. But at the same time, we can understand what the signatures of these plants are because someone's gone out and observed them. They've written about them. They've got great pictures that we can see in the books that allow us to understand it. And we can have a physical representation of that remedy in our hand in the form of what that essence in the bottle is about. And that's really all that you need to know for this kind of work. We don't necessarily have to go all the way back to the plant. We just have to go back as far as the remedy that we have.
Yeah, it's more about the energy.
Yeah, we're dealing with the energies. So the physical plant at this point becomes kind of superfluous to our healing process because we've extracted everything we need for our healing purposes from the plant and put it in this little brown bottle with a dropper on top of it. So that is what we want to work. And P.S., the Australian remedies work extremely well. One of my favorite kits that I work with are the 4 kits that I work with. So
I was just curious.
Yeah.
Well, then my other question is because I was hearing about the biodynamic calendar, like the flower day, the fruit day, when's the best time to. So have you ever noticed, if you make a flower essence on a flower day according to biodynamics?
Okay, all right. I don't work with biodynamics myself, but as an astrologer, I am always very aware of what's going on in the sky when I make it. In fact, a lot of my mother essence bottles will have little drawings of what the chart looked like.
I noticed that, so I thought we could probably have a unique perspective on that.
Yeah, and And also there's an astrology of plants as well that goes on. We won't go into that tonight so much, but you particularly have to follow the moon positions, because the plants are extremely receptive to the moon and some of the faster moving planets. But again, if I make a remedy under certain astrological conditions, it will pick up those astrological conditions as well.
Are you going to teach a class?
Not directly, but I mean, the last time I tried to deal with teaching a class on basically making remedies directly from astrological events, like coming up this Sunday night is a lunar eclipse, and I'm going to be channeling that energy into a little crystal and transferring it to water and making that water into a homeopathic remedy. I've found invariably those types of remedies are extremely powerful, although I've never been able to, I've tried it in a lot of my students over the years, and no one's been able to give me a coherent explanation of what it's doing to them. It all goes like, whoa, that was really powerful. Well, what happened? I don't know. So yeah, you can work directly at that level. And I also say that one time I tried to teach this thing, and I was giving my students like about 6 to 8 months to kind of get their energy bodies up to speed so they can handle these energies, because it's a really intense amount of energy that's flowing through your body when you make these remedies. I burned out the whole class. It was the weirdest class I ever taught, and it totally fell apart after about 6 months because no one was able to handle the energies, and everyone was just having nervous breakdowns. You know, all their psychological issues were coming up to be addressed, and I don't think anyone was really ready to work at that level. So it's a more gradual process that you need to go through. You know, I have the benefit of having invented that process, so you know, I've been able to work my way up over the course of years in order to be able to handle these energies. But it's not something to take lightly. So
I planted plastic plants, like flowers, you know, and I couldn't believe the number of bees that were attracted to the plastic flowers. And people came by and thought they were real and everything. It seemed like it was. I get a lot of compliments. Oh, how'd you grow a little garden?
Yeah. Apparently the bees were not experts on the doctrine of signatures. Okay. So let's see. So we have the whole idea of the energy of the plant being carried over into the energy of the remedy itself. And the description of the signatures that we take for the remedy are usually going to be expressed here in human terms. Now, let's just give a few little examples here. A lot of the plants that we use, those signatures for the plants haven't really been studied that deeply. And so the signature descriptions are kind of like a little bit sketchy and not very well filled out. So for instance, the remedy aspen that's in the box set, typically described as for like fear and anxiety and just like a nervous disposition. And they always say like, oh yeah, well, look at the aspen tree. The flower, you know, the leaves on it just kind of have this little flutter, and they're always like, you know, changing from, you know, one color on the bottom to another color on the top, and they're fluttering in the wind, and they're always being set aside. And that kind of jitteriness is typical of the way that the person talks about. Okay, yeah, I mean, that's a legitimate signature of the plant and the correspondence to the human behavior. Not terribly deep though. You can let, and it works extremely well, yeah. So like sometimes we're using the signatures in seemingly very simplistic fashions, but it still works. And it helps you remember what the plant's about. Like I said, we use these as memory devices for the plants as well. Anger remedies are very, very commonly ones that have sharp, pointy leaves and spines and stuff on them that will prick you and, you know, make life really miserable for the person who happens to walk in them. And they have a tendency to always to be red colored. Red being that kind of angry, fiery color that kind of like gets people to, you know, we even have the expression in our vernacular, that person, he's seeing red as a way of saying he's in a state of anger and being overexcited and over involved like that. Very interesting study is the Mimulus and monkey flower family. There's actually 5 different remedies that are in this family, 1 in the box set and 4 of them in the FES ones. And they all have the underlying signature that they deal with the emotion of fear. Fear and anxiety are just being upset and out of sorts with whatever's bothering them. All 5 of them are fear related to something different, even though they're all very closely related, botanically. And you can figure out the difference between them. What type of fear is it? What's the topic or the object of that fear based on the color of the plant, of the flower itself. The typical one that we're familiar with is the Mimulus that's in the box set. And that's kind of a yellowish one, yellowish flower, which means that it's dealing with kind of like the mental level. So it's worries and anxieties and kind of like the petty concerns that we have that where we don't really know how to come to terms with it. And so we're just a little fearful of it, kind of back away from these things. But the 4 North American versions of it would be things like the Scarlet monkey flower, which deals with, that's a reddish color flower, and that one deals with repressed anger. So again, we had that signature that the red flower tends to be with kind of like the anger, more violent types of expressions. There is a sticky monkey flower, which I'm not quite sure why it got the name sticky, but I assume it's got some sap or something that does it, which is fear or anxiety or unease that's related to sexual behavior. I think it's probably that sticky quality that relates to, say, like the liquids and fluids that are produced by the human body during sexuality. There's a pink monkey flower, which is one that I use a lot. Pink usually relates to the heart chakra. And the pink monkey flower is one where you feel like there's something terribly wrong inside and that you just don't want people to see what a horrible person you are. So you're always kind of putting up this fake facade that kind of hides who you truly are from other people, because there's a lot of guilt and shame feelings that are attracted. So you're basically shutting down the heart. And there's even a purple monkey flower. Purple, again, deals with spiritual issues. And purple monkey flower deals for people who have trouble relating to various spiritual disciplines, especially if they've moved from the religion of their family to some other types of religion or spiritual path somewhere along the line. And they're still having a lot of these guilt and anxiety feelings in the background of like, oh God, I'm strayed from the true path. So even within a family, they're all related to each other. They all have that concept of fear, but just because the signature is slightly different through the colors and probably some other issues related with the plants, you're going to get totally different response from the person based on just that small change in the signatures there. Now, I do want to go into one plant that I like the best because you can really see the doctrine of signatures in a really full-blown fashion. And that is the essence of dandelion. Dandelion is typically used as a remedy that kind of like reaches into the body and pulls out suppressed emotions that are being held in the neuromuscular system. Typically, you're going to see it expressed through symptoms of tightness, anxiety, and just like you're kind of like all crumpled up like that. Okay, let's look at the plant for a minute. Dandelions are known for that huge taproot that goes down into the dark earth. It's pulling things up through, from the ground, through the root, up into the leaves, up into the flowers. Bright yellow flowers at first, which is saying like, there's a mental component that's going on here. We're dealing with something that is hidden in the human body at a deep level that is going to express itself psychological level as well. It's not just the neuromuscular system. It's something that's dealing with it at a more, more spiritual, more psychological level as well. And what happens to that yellow flower? Closes up. When it comes back, it's the bright white puffball thing. And what happens to the puffball? The wind comes along, scatters it to the four winds. It's gone. Okay, how would you take this lifestyle description of the dandelion and translate into human terms? The remedy is reaching into the body, bringing up all these repressed emotions that are being held as tension in the musculature, bringing it to the surface, allowing it to be expressed and understood, and through not only the mental understanding, which is represented both by the yellow color of the flower initially, but also the wind itself is a symbol of the mental realm. The air element is always related to the way the mind works. This is where you have to start studying all sorts of symbolism, all sorts of different mystical systems in order to really figure out, how do all these symbols relate to each other here. But what happens then is the wind comes along, and through that mental understanding of, oh, I don't have to hold on to these tensions in my body anymore. I don't have to hold on to these problems that are bothering me. I can release it. The exhale says, okay, there's the air that's blowing it out right there. It's getting rid of it and just scattering it to the wind, saying, like, give this back to the universe. This is not mine anymore. I don't have to hold on to this. That is the way the dandelion works as an essence. And so you can see that all the signatures of the plants translate over to the signatures of how a human being is going to release this tension from their body and move on from it. So that is how the essence is working at a symbolic level within us. So take some time when you're studying a plant to try and figure out what this kind of symbolism is about, because there's a lot that's going on there that is not really obvious if you just casually look at the plant. All right, now get to the realm of people per se. This was the key aha moment that I had several months back that was a kind of a little bit of a turning point to the way that I'm organizing certain chapters in my book related to what the human energy body is like. Everything that we've said to this point about subtle energies and signatures and correspondences and blah, 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 everything we've said about plants applies to people as well. And so all the language we have about talking about energy can be used plants, can be used people, and it's that way of communicating between the different types of organisms that allows the plants to have a healing response within us. As a matter of fact, this is one of those things where, like I said, I write notes to myself in my computer file and then come back for the next 4 or 5 months going like, what did I mean by that? And literally the whole understanding that started this talk tonight was just the little phrase, signature of a person. What did I mean by that? And I'm gradually, slowly starting to figure this out. And one of the nice things about having to do this talk is that it's forced me to kind of work through some of these issues tonight. A flower essence consultation always starts with just getting to know the person. We use some of the old standby tools, like talking to them, observing them physically, kind of getting a sense of what their energy feels like. And the great tool of our times is, reading the pulse, because the pulse is going to be a very, very explicit description of what's going on in the person energetically. So we're just doing the same sort of thing for understanding a human being as we do with the plant, except we're doing it in a consulting room instead of in our backyard garden. When you gather all that information and correlate it and start to make sense of it, that gives you a signature of the person. It's a description of what's going on with them energetically. It's not the energy self description per se, but it gives you some clues of how you work backwards in order to figure out where is this person out of balance. How do we get into there to reboot them and bring them back to balance? And in particular, which plants are going to be very helpful for doing this? So we need to use the signature of the person that we find during the consultation in order to match them up to remedies, and bring about bring the two together in order to get them into a healing relationship with each other. Every element of the person's life is an expression of what their energy body is doing. Everything about us is an expression of our energy body. Everything that we do and say and think and feel, and the way our body is shaped, and which illnesses we have, and what we do for a job, and where we live, and everything is an expression of our energy body. And so we can use this all as tools to help us understand what's going on energetically. One of the difficulties is that much of this expression is going to be going on at an unconscious level. So it's a little bit harder to pull that out. And this is where you need the relationship between the client and the practitioner, because the practitioner has to act as a mirror to the person to allow these patterns to come up into conscious awareness so that they can be addressed properly and released. But as we said with my friend, the Willow Tree, all this way that the energy body of a human being expresses itself is just simply a matter of, this is what we do. This is who we are at a deep level. So let's just work with the human beings the same way we work with the plants and see what we can come up with. Now, as I said, human signatures are usually described in terms of stories. And this is the first thing that you do when you sit down with a person for a flower essence consultation. You just simply say, oh, hi, how you doing? You know, what brings you here? What is it that's you're concerned about, that you need to, that you're wanting to get some help with it? And they will start talking and talking and talking and talking your ears off. I think the world's record so far is I had one who went on for 2 hours straight with their whole life history at a very, very deep and intricate spiritual level before we actually got around to saying, okay, well, let's see what your pulse is saying too. But usually people go on for like about 15, 20, 30 minutes with their story. And that story contains all the seeds of what's going on with them energetically. So the story itself is a very, very good good set of symptoms or signatures of the human being themselves. Now, there are many, many types of stories. There are the ones that we tell ourselves, basically for two basic purposes. One of them, we use the stories to define who we are and what we think of ourselves and how we identify our personal nature. The flip side of that is we also tell stories to ourselves to deny reality. There's often things that we just don't want to face or talk about. So consequently, we build up a story that acts as kind of a fortress to keep all that stuff out so we don't have to think about it. And usually that just winds up going into the unconscious mind. And we don't have to deal with that until, of course, we have to deal with it. In which case, then we wind up wanting to find a flower remedy that's going to alleviate the problems. Then there are also stories that we never really even acknowledge to ourselves, that we always are just acting things out unconsciously. Again, this is just because this is who we are and this is what we do. And so this is where things like, observing the person's body language, the way that they talk, not the content of their speech, but the manner of their speech. How do they sit in a chair? You can tell a heck of a lot about a person just simply by watching how they get in a chair. Are they, very forward, direct? Are they kind of like leaning into you? Are they kind of like pulling back? The one that I always like is the big slumpy ones like this, which is where the person's kind of like collapsed in on themselves, which is the, I always forget the name of this plant, but it's one that grows here. Just the way that the body expresses itself, regardless of what's coming out of the person's mouth, will teach you a lot about how they're expressing their energies. So you have to take all these various stories and descriptions and so on and kind of relate them to each other. And as you do this more and more and more, you start to get a really sense of how this person's working as an energy being and how you're supposed to address it. Besides the story, there's also going to be things like physical symptoms and stuff that's objectively observable, although in fluorescence work, that seems like that sort of material seems to be kind of secondary compared to the more the narrative that goes on with people. That'd be a whole set of another set of things, but yeah. I mean, you got to see that the way that they relate to food is going to also have an effect on themselves, and so yeah, and as it affects the body, then the body, of course, then it's going to show up also at the psychological level as well. Nothing like a good sinus headache to teach you a connection between the physical body and psychological realm. One thing I really, really caution you if you're doing fluorescence consultations with people is do not ever settle for single word descriptions of what's going on with people. You know, I get really tired of people saying like, what do you got for depression? What do you got for anxiety? What do you got for muscle cramps? I mean, it's always like, it's like you're reducing the person down to one single word, which never works. Particularly, work, well, like the bane of kind of like my herbalism part of my practice at the store. I've got a headache. What do you have for headaches? Which kind of headache? Where? How does it express? You know, blah, blah. And there's like 15 different kinds of headache. Help me. Give me some information that I can actually go on, because it's all going to be different remedies. And so anytime that you're reducing the person down to these one-word descriptions, you're reducing them to a caricature, not a signature. You're just saying like, yep, you're this little checkbox in the book. You know, that's not going to tell you anything about how to treat this person. You need to know how the energy body is really, really working. For that, you need a full-blown signature of the person, not just these little one-word descriptions. So anyway, this whole consultation business is just a way to observe as many forms of expression that the energy body for this person has, in as many ways as you possibly can, until you could put it all together and integrate it and come up with a description of the person's, how they work energetically, that's concrete and that makes sense to you. You reach that point of it making sense where you got the, aha, I know which remedy you need. Then your work is basically done at that point. So it's that point of really understanding the signature to the point where you can start to matching it up with remedies. That is the key to this kind of work. And this is where, you know, good case taking is a really, really important skill to develop for this type of work. And then you're going to include a lot of intangible and nonverbal ways that the person expresses themselves for this type of work, particularly, like I said, things like body language, tone of voice, and so on. Okay, now I've left for the last part here, the reading the pulse. There are probably dozens and dozens of ways to read the pulse. If you're curious about some of the more physical ways of doing it, Matt Wood and some of his friends came out about 4 or 5 years ago with a wonderful book on pulse evaluation that I would highly recommend to you. And I've gotten through the book maybe about 1.5 times at this point, and it always kind of like intimidates me how much material they have in there. My way of reading the pulse, despite the fact that I studied with Matt many years ago, was I kind of ignore the physical pulse completely in my work, well, almost completely, and really just use it as a gateway to start to feel what's going on energetically in the person directly. Once you get used to this, you can use the pulse here as a way to just start roaming around inside their aura anywhere you want to, picking up all sorts of little information, find out where they're hiding their problems that are the stuck areas of their psyche. What's going on? Ooh. Okay. There's a symptom. Okay. Oh, okay. All right. We're inside the building. Okay. We can ignore them. All right.
National Weather Service. Severe thunderstorm warning in effect for this area until 8:30 p.m. Central Daylight Saving Time for destructive
All right. Okay. Well, by the time we're done, we can ignore them. Okay. So, so as I said, the pulse is a gateway to sensing the energy body at a very, very deep level. In particular, I use it as a way to make particular contact to each of the 7 chakra points within the person's body, because you can read a lot of information out of the patterns that are in the chakras. And that will describe to a great degree how the energy body is all messed up and how to go in there and get things back into a balance so the person will start to work right. And in particular, the pulse testing also allows you to test the individual remedies against the person to see whether it's something that's going to be compatible with them and going to help them with their patterns. Okay, that brings us to the last step of a typical consultation, which is trying to come up with a remedy for the person, bringing the person and the appropriate remedies together for the purposes of healing. The phrase I use for it is matchmaking. It's literally like a dating service, as Lisa likes to call it. But matchmaking is it's a relationship. It's a coming together of the flower, the remedy, and the person that we're dealing with. Okay, I didn't know I was that controversial. Okay. So when you form this relationship, the 2 energy fields, the energy field of the flower or the remedy is going to come in contact with the person, and there's going to be an interaction or a change going on here. So when 2 fields come together in a constructive or supportive manner like this, you don't really have to do much. You can just sit back at that point, because healing will naturally happen when the 2 fields start to talk to each other and communicate and start to interact with each other. And I describe it as a constructive, supportive manner very deliberately. There's 2 main philosophies about choosing remedies.
Sorry to disturb you, but there's an emergency alert.
Okay. Yes.
Get away from the window.
Okay. All right. Okay, so so one of these techniques is called the law of similars, and that is the idea that whatever a plant can cause in the person is also what it's going to be able to cure. This is the technique that.
Gather around closer to you.
Yeah, we'll get cozy here. Okay, so the law of similars is just basically saying that what a plant causes, you can also cure. And this is
like pollen, right?
Yep. You can use it to intimidate. And this is the whole basis behind homeopathy. This is one of the key.
Should we get out of the room?
Shelter in this door if you'd like to come with us.
Okay.
If there is an emergency.
All right.
Well, I've got like about.
You're almost done, right?
Yeah, I've got like about 10 minutes at this point. Yeah. Okay.
Do it in 5.
So the law of similars is one way to work with, and that works very well with homeopathy. There's also something called the law of contraries, which is more useful in herbalism, and that's that you use something that's different than the illness that you're trying to cure, because that difference allows it to counteract the original imbalance. Now, the more I read about the law of similars and the law of contraries, in particular the big philosophical wars that this causes between different healing modalities, I've kind of feel that both of these laws are a bit.
I'm sorry, it is a take shelter immediately warning.
Okay, well, I'm done here in about 5 minutes.
Okay.
Okay.
Now, there is a shelter, you go through the registers and turn to your left.
Okay.
You'll see a sign that says employees only.
Yep.
Go through that door.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. So both of these laws are a little bit simplistic, and there's always a conflict between them, which causes great sectarian wars between different modalities. And this is why I say my approach is more that you're looking to make a good relationship between the plant and the person, whatever good relationship is going to be. And you use the pulse there as a way to specifically decide what this idea of compatibility is for them.
Martin, what's an example of that? Like the opposite, what's an example? Just like.
Well, okay, contraries?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, okay. So, for instance, this would be kind of a more herbal thing. If the person is having a fever with a lot of chills to them, you're not going to want to give them, a really cold plant like cucumber or something like that. You want to give them something that's warm and nourishing. Certainly, if they have a raging fever, you want something that's going to cool them down. Whereas in homeopathy, like a raging fever, you'd want to give them a plant like, say, like belladonna that would probably cause a fever, because the way that the homeopathy works, it kind of goes in there and completes the fever for the person. Once the completion is done and the remedy wears off, then it's gone. Okay. So we can use the pulse testing as a way to test the remedies, see whether they're compatible with the person, and also to figure out whether the various remedies themselves are compatible with each other. And when you do this properly and the person takes the remedy, you can, well, it's a phenomenon that I always find amazing. When the person takes the remedy, there's an explosion that goes on inside their aura. You literally can feel their energy just like boosh out like maybe 10, 20 feet from the person. And it might take about 20 seconds or so to rebound and come back in. And when it rebounds into the person's body, after that 20 seconds, then you start to see the funny faces going, oh, what's going on? Something really funny that's happening here. That explosion effect is, which can be felt either directly and personally if you're, when without touching the person, or through the pulse, depending on how sensitive you are to the energies. That healing response is, again, it's a shift in the energy body. The energy body is expressing through its behavior, through that explosion, I am resolving this imbalance, and now I'm going on. That explosion is the symptom of the healing behavior, of the healing process that's going on. So you can think of that explosion as the signature of the healing process itself. Okay, so that's flower essence therapy in a nutshell. And when I finish my book, then you can read the other 200 pages that go on with this.